Welcome to the History Maps podcast.
Mm.
When you look at a deep canyon wall, you can generally see these distinct layers of rock and sediment stacked right on top of each other.
Right, yeah.
And, each band of color represents a different geological epoch. You can literally read the passage of time in the stone. But when you look at the history of human civilizations, especially the transition of a massive region into an entirely new cultural and religious sphere, that canyon wall is rarely composed of neat horizontal lines.
No, it's usually a mess.
Exactly. Today, our deep dive into the sources explores the Muslim conquests of Afghanistan. This is a key part of our Islamic history series. And the evidence we have, we're talking historical chronicles, Arabic geographic accounts, and even these recently translated Bactrian documents, it reveals a process that took centuries.
It really did.
It was characterized by slow acculturation, constantly shifting tax codes, and just a deeply fragmented landscape.
Yeah, I mean, we are looking at a region right at the crossroads of the Sassanid, the Tang Chinese, and the Indian empires. It was home to Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and all these local solar cults.
And the historical narrative often paints conquests as these overnight events. Like a battle is won and a new era just instantly begins. But the sources we're exploring today show a much more multi-generational integration.
Yeah, and to really understand how that integration played out, we first have to establish the baseline. I mean, the Arab armies emerging from the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, they didn't just encounter a unified state in this region.
Not at all.
Right. They encountered this incredibly complex, highly fractured matrix of local powers. If we look at the western and southwestern regions encompassing areas like Herat and Sistan, we see a landscape that was firmly integrated into the Sasanian Empire.
Which was the preeminent Persian power of late antiquity.
Exactly.
And the defining characteristic of Sasanian rule in this specific frontier was Zoroastrianism, which was supported directly by the state apparatus, right?
Yeah, it was, yeah. The sources detail the presence of major Zoroastrian fire temples, like there was a very prominent one at Karkuya in Sistan.
Right.
And these temples weren't just places of worship. I mean, they were economic and administrative hubs. The sacred fires were kept burning perpetually, tended by this highly organized priesthood that wielded a ton of influence over local affairs.
But the actual political administration by the Sasanian central government was characterized by a relatively light viceregal touch, if I'm reading the sources right.
Yeah, that's accurate.
The sources mention the region was governed by an official known as an Isbabad. So how did that role actually function on a day-to-day basis?
Well, the Isbabad was essentially a military governor or, a viceroy appointed by the Sasanian court. But because this eastern frontier was so far from the imperial capital in Ctesiphon, the Isbabad just could not micromanage the daily lives of the population.
They were just too far away.
Exactly. Their primary mandate was basically twofold. One, extract regular tax revenues to send back west. And two, police the frontiers against nomadic incursions coming down from the Central Asian steppes.
Right, so as long as the local nobility delivered the taxes and kept things quiet.
The Isbabad left the existing social structures pretty much entirely intact.
So if you were a local landowner in Sistan, your interaction with the Sasanian state was mostly financial. You paid your dues, you honored the fire temple, and you were left alone.
Pretty much.
But the moment we travel north into regions like Bactria and Takharistan, that Persian Zoroastrian influence drops off and we enter an entirely different cultural zone.
Oh, completely different.
Yeah.
The northern landscape was dominated by a vast Buddhist footprint.
Right.
This was the enduring legacy of the Kushan Empire, which had flourished centuries earlier, and just the continuous flow of ideas along the Silk Road. The Bamiyan Valley is probably the most striking example detailed in the accounts.
With the massive statues.
Right. Between the 4th and 6th centuries, monumental Buddha statues were carved directly into the cliff faces. And these weren't just isolated monuments, They were the centerpieces of a thriving monastic network that drew pilgrims and merchants from all across Asia.
The economic scale of these Buddhist institutions just seems staggering. I mean, the sources specifically highlight the city of Balkh and the Nabahar Monastery. We often think of monasteries as these quiet places of ascetic retreat, but Nabahar sounds a lot more like a massive corporation.
Yeah, it functioned very much like a feudal estate or even like a modern agricultural conglomerate.
Really?
Yeah. Nabahar possessed sprawling tracts of arable land, they managed complex irrigation systems, and collected rents from literally thousands of tenant farmers.
Wow. I mean, that's a massive operation.
It was. The administrators of this monastery basically controlled the regional economy. Their wealth and influence rivaled that of any political governor. The spiritual authority of Buddhism and Bactria was just deeply intertwined with immense agrarian wealth.
Okay, so we have the Zoroastrian west, the Buddhist north. Then we have a third distinct zone. We move south and east into Buddhistan and Kabulistan. And the cultural orientation shifts again away from both Persia and Central Asian Buddhism and moves toward the Indian subcontinent.
Right. And this is where we encounter indigenous dynasties known as the Zunbils and the Kabul Shahis. The religious focus here was highly localized and really syncretic. The Zunbils, for instance, derived their political legitimacy from the cult of Zun. Yeah, Zun was a solar deity, and the sources actually trace its roots back to pre-Zoroastrian Indo-Iranian traditions.
So it's distinct from the state-sponsored Zoroastrianism of the West.
Entirely distinct. The worship of Zun involved these massive hilltop shrines, and the iconography often shared parallels with Hindu solar deities like Surya, or even incorporated elements of Shaivite practices.
Interesting.
So the culture of Sabulistan and Kabulistan looked east and south toward the Indus Valley for its trade and cultural exchange.
And the linguistic diversity outlined in the sources perfectly mirrors this religious fragmentation, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
We have the Bactrian language being used for administration. The sources point out this fascinating detail. Bactrian is an Iranian language, but the documents we have are written in Cyrillic script.
Yeah, it's quite the mix.
That layered complexity is just everywhere. You have records of Nestorian Christian bishoprics operating in Herat, sitting right alongside Jewish cemeteries.
The urban centers were deeply cosmopolitan. I mean, a merchant in a market in Balkh or Kabul would have navigated conversations in Bactrian, Sogdian, early Turkic dialects, and various Indic languages just in a single day.
Right.
The constant movement of trade demanded this high level of multilingualism and cultural accommodation.
You know, I think we need to pause here and address how we conceptualize this geography today. We tend to project the modern boundaries of Afghanistan backward into the 7th century, imagining it as a single monolithic entity.
Which is a mistake.
Right. The sources make it very clear that is fundamentally incorrect. It really helps to visualize this region, not as a country, but as a geopolitical fault line.
That's a good way to put it.
We have these massive tectonic plates of different civilizations, the Persian plate to the west, the Indian plate to the south, the Turkic and Chinese plates to the east and north, all grinding against each other.
And that friction is exactly what generated these distinct, highly resilient cultural zones. The mountain ranges of the Hindu Kush basically acted as physical barriers that allowed these different pockets of civilization to develop independently and fortify themselves.
Which brings us to the catalyst that violently disrupts this equilibrium. In the middle of the 7th century, the Sasanian Empire, that great Western tectonic plate, suddenly shatters.
It does.
So how does the collapse of Central Persian authority bring the armies of the Rashidun Caliphate to the doorstep of these mountain kingdoms?
Well, the collapse was incredibly rapid and just catastrophic for the Sassanids. In the 630s, Arab Muslim armies coming out of the Arabian Peninsula inflicted a series of decisive defeats on the Sasanian military in Mesopotamia.
Right, the core of their territory.
Exactly. The Sassanid king, Yazdegerd III, was forced to abandon his capital and flee eastward. He was essentially a sovereign without a state at that point, attempting to raise a new army from the eastern provinces that, as we discussed, had historically operated with a high degree of autonomy.
The psychology of that moment is just fascinating to think about. You have a defeated monarch fleeing into the frontier, expecting the local Isbabads and the nobility to rally to his defense. But his arrival doesn't exactly inspire a massive counteroffensive, does it?
No, it does the exact opposite. By 650, Yazdegerd reaches Kerman and then moves into Sistan. He arrives with a very large royal retinue and just immediately demands substantial tax contributions from the local governors to fund his resistance.
Oh, that's not going to go over well.
Not at all. He attempts to exert central imperial authority at the exact moment he possesses the absolute least actual power.
He essentially alienates the very people he needs to survive.
He demands resources from local elites who are well aware that the Sasanian military has already been decimated. I mean, they refuse to empty their own treasuries for a lost cause.
Right. Why would they?
Exactly. So Yazdegerd loses their support. He is forced to flee further north to Merv, and his reign ends unceremoniously in 651 when he is assassinated. And the sources actually specify he was killed by a local miller.
A miller. The last emperor of a dynasty that ruled for 4 centuries, assassinated in a mill on the fringes of his former empire.
Yeah, it's quite an ending.
And with Yazdegerd dead, the Arab armies do not stop at the old Sasanian borders. They push directly into that power vacuum.
The pursuit was relentless. Arab commanders like Unuf ibn Qais led cavalry forces into the region of Khorasan. Operating out of the newly established garrison city of Basra in Iraq, Unuf moved rapidly. By 651, his forces had already secured Herat and reached Merv.
The speed of that advance implies they weren't exactly fighting massive, entrenched armies at every single step.
They weren't. They were capitalizing on profound exhaustion.
Wow, okay.
The Sasanian state had spent the previous several decades engaged in this grueling, resource-straining war with the Byzantine Empire. The local populations in the eastern provinces were just heavily taxed and incredibly war-weary.
So they were already spent.
Exactly. When the Arab armies arrived, offering treaties that often simply required the payment of tribute in exchange for local autonomy, many provincial leaders just chose submission over a feudal military resistance.
That makes sense. And while Unuf ibn Qais is sweeping through the north, there is a simultaneous military push into the southwest, into Sistan. The sources detail a campaign led by a commander named Rabi ibn Ziyad al-Harithi.
Yes, Rabi ibn Ziyad arrived with an army of several thousand and focused heavily on Zaranj, which was the capital and the administrative heart of Sistan. But this was not a rapid capitulation. No, he laid siege to the city for 7 months.
7 months. I mean, that requires a massive logistical effort. You have to feed thousands of soldiers, maintain sanitation, and prevent the besieged city from resupplying, all in a totally unfamiliar landscape.
Right, and the length of the siege demonstrates that the local defenses were formidable, but also that the Arab forces were developing the capacity for sustained military operations far from their bases in Iraq. Eventually, the city's defender was killed in a skirmish, and the population of Zaranj was forced to submit, agreeing to a treaty that mandated an annual tribute.
So the extraction of tribute seems to be the primary goal here.
Initially, yes.
But there is a specific narrative vignette from a few years later, in 653, that introduces a slightly different dynamic. An Arab commander named Abd al-Rahman ibn Samura pushes further east, beyond Sistan, into Zamindawar.
Right, the territory of the Zunbils.
Exactly. And he specifically targets the shrine of the sun god, Zun.
Yeah, this incident provides a really clear window into the strategies of early conquest. Ibn Samura arrives at the sacred hilltop temple with his cavalry. He locates the central idol of Zun, which the sources say was a massive figure adorned with precious gems.
And he doesn't just smash it to pieces, right? He performs a very specific, almost theatrical act.
He does. The sources say he breaks off one of the idol's hands and physically plucks out the rubies that formed its eyes.
He dismantles its most valuable and striking features.
He does, but the critical part of the account is what he does immediately next. The local governor, the Marzban, is present. Ibn Samura turns to him and explicitly states that his intention was to prove that this idol could do neither harm nor good.
I am trying to understand the deeper strategy here, because it is easy to read that as pure religious zealotry, destroying the false idol. But considering the context of extracting treaties and tribute, it feels much more calculated.
It is a textbook example of psychological iconoclasm. Ibn Samura was not necessarily trying to force the immediate religious conversion of the Marzban or the local population right then and there.
Okay, so what was he doing?
He was demonstrating a monopoly on power. Remember, the deity Zan was the source of political legitimacy for the local rulers.
Right.
So by physically mutilating the god and showing that it could not defend itself, let alone its worshippers, Ibn Samura was proving that the old political order was completely powerless against the new reality of the Arab military presence.
It forces the Marzban to realize that if his god cannot protect its own ruby eyes, it certainly cannot protect the city walls.
Precisely the intended effect. And following this demonstration, the Marzban did indeed agree to a treaty and the payment of tribute.
But, this raises a major logistical question. We are tracking armies that develop their tactics in the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula and the lowlands of Mesopotamia.
Yeah.
How do they handle the brutal realities of the Hindu Kush? The vertical terrain, the narrow passes, the severe winters.
Oh, they struggled significantly. The geography absolutely dictated the limits of their expansion. These early incursions in the 7th century were primarily just raids.
Go ahead.
The Arab forces would move rapidly during the campaigning season, utilize their cavalry advantage in the broader valleys, lay siege to lowland oasis cities, extract a treaty for tribute, and then they'd withdraw.
So they aren't setting up permanent governors or establishing complex bureaucracies in these mountain regions quite yet.
No, they lacked the manpower and the logistical supply lines to maintain any kind of permanent occupation in the highlands. As a result, this cyclical pattern emerged.
What kind of pattern?
Well, the Arab army would march away, or the harsh winter snows would close the passes. The moment the immediate military threat vanished, the local mountain tribes would just withhold their tribute, break the treaties, and reassert their independence.
Just reset the board.
Exactly. And the next spring, a new Arab commander would have to return and conquer the exact same territory all over again.
It's an endless loop of raid, submission, retreat, and rebellion.
Yeah, it was exhausting for everyone.
So to break that cycle, the strategy has to shift from extracting wealth to fundamentally altering the local institutions. And the sources show that transition begins in the early 8th century, focusing on the northern frontier under the Umayyad Caliphate.
Right, and the key figure in this shift is Qutayba ibn Muslim. He was appointed the Umayyad governor of Khorasan, serving from 705 to 715. His overarching directive was to cross the Oxus River and subdue the rebellious principalities in Transoxiana. But to launch campaigns safely into Central Asia, he first had to guarantee the absolute security of his rear flank, which was the region of Balkh and Turkestan in northern Afghanistan.
And Qutayba approaches this pacification differently than the earlier commanders who just took the tribute and left right.
Very differently, Qutayba's campaigns were designed for permanent subjugation. He relied on prolonged sieges to break fortified cities, he established permanent Arab garrisons in strategic locations, and he instituted a policy of severe, uncompromising retaliation against any form of rebellion.
The sources detail the rebellion of a local leader named Nizak Tarkan. This seems to be where we see the full extent of Qutayba's methodology.
Yeah, Nizak Tarkan was a Hephthalite leader who recognized the existential threat Qutayba posed to the local aristocracy. In 709, Nizak attempted a massive coordinated uprising.
How massive?
He managed to unite several local princes and factions in Turkestan, creating a very formidable coalition against the Umayyad forces.
That is a serious challenge to Umayyad authority.
Yeah.
So how does Qutayba respond?
He methodically isolates and destroys the coalition. He uses a combination of military force and strategic diplomacy to peel away Nizak's allies one by one. Eventually, Nizak is cornered in a fortified mountain retreat. Facing starvation and a protracted siege, he is forced to surrender.
Now, the earlier commanders might have taken a ransom or renegotiated a tribute in that situation, but Qutayba has a different objective.
He does. Qutayba ordered the execution of Nizak Tarkan and a systematic massacre of his followers.
Which is brutal.
It is, and the historical chronicles provide this chilling metric for the scale of the violence. They record that the blood from the executions flowed in such volume that it physically turned the wheel of a local watermill.
The image of a blood mill, that is just...
It's horrifying.
Ugh.
Furthermore, the accounts state that Qutayba had sworn an oath to crush the rebellion so thoroughly that he would eat bread made from flour ground by the blood of his enemies.
And did he?
The sources claim he fulfilled that oath, consuming bread from that specific mill.
Okay, if I am trying to understand the strategy here beyond the sheer terror of it, if your ultimate goal as an empire is to establish a stable province that generates reliable, long-term tax revenue,
Right.
wouldn't slaughtering thousands of people just destroy your own economic base? Why resort to a massacre that dramatic?
It is a calculated use of absolute terror to break the psychological will to resist. Qutayba determined that the recurrent rebellions were actually costing the Umayyad state more in military expenditure than they were ever gaining in tribute. So by completely eradicating the local aristocratic leadership, the people who possessed the institutional knowledge and authority to organize resistance, he created a political vacuum. He was willing to accept a temporary economic loss to ensure long-term, unchallenged control.
And into that vacuum, a different kind of integration begins to take root. We move from military coercion to administrative acculturation. The Arab governors realize that while they can conquer the territory, they do not possess the localized knowledge to manage the complex agrarian economies,
They didn't know the irrigation networks or the specific tax registers of these vast provinces.
Right, so they required an indigenous bureaucracy.
They did, and this necessity created immense opportunities for local elites who were willing to adapt. The most prominent example in the sources is the trajectory of the Barmakid family.
We discussed the Nabahar Monastery in Balkh earlier, that massive, wealthy Buddhist estate. The Barmakids were the families who ran it.
Exactly. The title Barmak actually derives from a Sanskrit term indicating a chief priest or chief administrator.
Okay.
For generations, this family had managed the immense agricultural wealth and spiritual authority of the monastery. When the Arab armies established permanent control over Balkh, the Barmakid leadership faced a really critical decision.
Resist and face the fate of Nizak Tarkhan, or adapt to the new power structure.
Right. They chose adaptation. The sources note that the head of the Barmakid family actually traveled to the Umayyad court in Syria and formally converted to Islam.
So this conversion, it was a highly pragmatic political maneuver.
Very much so. By adopting the religion of the conquerors, the Barmakids integrated themselves into the new ruling class. They ensured that while the overarching political authority changed from Buddhist to Islamic, the actual management of the region's agricultural wealth remained right in their hands.
They preserved their localized power by changing their ideological allegiance.
Precisely.
But the Barmakids do not remain local administrators in Balkh. Their political instincts allow them to survive the next massive upheaval in Islamic history.
Yeah, in 750, the Abbasid revolution overthrows the Umayyad Caliphate.
Right.
The center of power shifts from Syria to Iraq. The Barmakids, utilizing their extensive networks and administrative acumen, align themselves with the victorious Abbasids. They relocate to the newly founded capital of Baghdad and rise to the absolute highest echelons of imperial power.
They become viziers, right?
Yeah.
The chief ministers, serving directly under caliphs like Harun al-Rashid.
They do. They transition from managing a regional Buddhist monastery to running the day-to-day operations of one of the largest empires in world history.
That is an incredible ascent.
It is, but their impact goes beyond just administration. They leverage their immense wealth and influence to actively bridge the cultural gap between the Afghan Indian periphery and the Islamic center.
Meaning they act as patrons of translation and scholarship.
Yes. They sponsored the translation of numerous Sanskrit texts into Arabic, focusing on medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. They even commissioned an Arabic versified biography of the Buddha.
Really?
Yeah. They recognized that the intellectual heritage of their homeland held immense value, and they deliberately wove that knowledge into the fabric of the burgeoning Islamic Golden Age in Baghdad.
The Barmakid story illustrates how elites navigated the conquest. But to understand how Islamization affected the general population, we have to look at the economics on the ground.
We do.
The sources provide these newly translated Bactrian documents from a rural town called Rob, and these records offer a very granular view of how changing tax codes drove social transformation.
The Bactrian documents are so vital because they bypass the grand political narratives entirely and show us the daily administrative realities.
Right.
They detail the implementation of the caliphal tax systems, specifically the jizya, which was a poll tax levied on non-Muslim subjects, and the kharaj, a tax on agricultural land and its produce.
There is a specific case study in these documents regarding a marriage contract that perfectly illustrates this dynamic. It centers on a woman named Zaran.
Right, so in the year 750, a document records a marriage contract where Zaran is married to 3 brothers simultaneously. Their names were Kamir Far, Waran, and Mir. This is a practice known as fraternal polyandry.
And when we look at historical practices like this, it is easy to assume they are just, cultural traditions. But the documents reveal a strict economic rationale behind brothers sharing a wife.
Absolutely. Under the pre-Islamic administrative system, and even during the early transition period, taxation and inheritance laws were fundamentally based on the household or the estate unit.
Okay, so the whole family is taxed together.
Right. In a harsh, mountainous agricultural environment, arable land is scarce. If 3 brothers were to marry separate wives and divide their inherited estate into 3 smaller plots, those divided plots might not generate enough yield to sustain 3 separate families and pay the required taxes.
The tax burden would just crush them if they split the farm.
Exactly. So by engaging in fraternal polyandry, the brothers kept the agricultural estate intact as a single, highly productive unit. They minimized their overall tax liability and ensured the financial survival of their household.
So the marriage structure was a direct response to the economic pressures of the local tax code.
It was.
But then we see a dramatic shift just 5 years later in the documentary record.
Yes, a subsequent document from 755 reveals that one of the brothers, Kamir Far, has formally converted to Islam. He has adopted the Arabic name Said.
Okay.
Furthermore, he is now recorded as being married exclusively to Zaran.
So the polyandrous arrangement has dissolved. What changed in 5 years to make him abandon the shared marriage?
The administrative structure changed. As the Islamic bureaucracy took firmer control of the region, they implemented their own legal and economic frameworks. The Islamic tax system levied the jizya and the kharaj on the individual rather than the household unit.
Ah, so the entire financial incentive for the marriage structure just vanishes?
Completely. Once taxes were assessed individually, keeping the estate undivided through polyandry no longer provided a tax shelter. In fact, by converting to Islam, Kamir Far, now Said, would have been exempt from the jizya entirely, significantly lowering his personal tax burden.
That is fascinating.
The economic rules of the society were rewritten, and the social structures down to the level of rural marriage contracts immediately adapted to the new reality.
This evidence fundamentally challenges the narrative that the region was converted primarily by military force. We have the Barmakids converting to secure political power in the new empire, and we have a farmer like Kamir Far converting to navigate a new individual tax code and avoid the jizya. It demonstrates that economics, taxation, and the desire for social mobility were really the true engines of Islamization.
The military conquests absolutely dismantled the old political boundaries and established the initial authority. But it was the bureaucratic machinery, the specific mechanisms of taxation, and the avenues for social advancement that slowly, methodically transformed the culture of the region over generations.
But, and this is a big but, that model of bureaucratic assimilation really only applies to the northern and western regions. When we look at the historical trajectory of the East and the South, we see a completely different outcome.
Very different.
The administrative expansion hits a wall of organized, violent resistance that lasts for over 2 centuries.
Yeah, the narrative of an inevitable, continuous Islamic expansion just stalls completely when it encounters the Kabul Shahis and the Zunbils. These dynasties mounted a sophisticated military and diplomatic defense that repeatedly shattered the armies sent from the caliphal centers.
Let's examine the Turk Shahis of Kabul. They established control around 665, displacing the previous rulers, the Nezak Huns.
Right.
The sources note their origins in the Western Turkic Khaganate. How does a dynasty of Turkic origin manage to hold off the Umayyad and Abbasid empires in the mountains of Kabul?
Their success was firmly rooted in military tactics that were perfectly adapted to the specific geography of the Hindu Kush.
Okay, how so?
Well, the early Arab armies were predominantly composed of infantry and light cavalry suited for open plains or desert warfare. The Turk Shahis, drawing on their steppe heritage, utilized highly mobile cavalry forces armed with composite bows.
And a composite bow in a mountain environment offers a massive tactical advantage.
It alters the engagement entirely. The Turk Shahis avoided pitched battles on open ground. They utilized the rugged vertical terrain to force the Arab armies into narrow passes and valleys where numbers basically meant nothing.
Right, you can't use a massive army in a tiny pass.
Exactly. They would launch coordinated ambushes from the high ground, just raining arrows down on the exposed infantry.
The sources also mention their use of feigned retreats.
Yeah, this is a classic steppe tactic, but it is devastating in the mountains. The Shahi cavalry would engage the Arab vanguard and then simulate a panicked retreat.
Draw them in.
Exactly. The Arab forces, sensing a rout, would break formation and pursue them deeper into the treacherous valleys, completely overextending their supply lines. Once the Arab army was thoroughly trapped in a choke point, the Shahis would wheel around and destroy them.
They are essentially running a 200-year insurgency. But it isn't just military tactics. The Turk Shahis are actively engaged in international diplomacy to secure their position.
They had to be. They recognized that they could not survive in isolation against the resources of the caliphate. So the Turk Shahis maintained diplomatic relations and nominal vassalage to the Tang dynasty in China.
Which is a huge superpower.
Huge. By sending regular tribute missions to the Tang court, they secured official recognition. And this was a very strategic calculation.
Because the Tang armies were too far away to actually help in a fight.
Right, they couldn't intervene directly in every skirmish, but the diplomatic alliance forced the Umayyads and Abbasids to seriously consider the geopolitical implications of a full-scale invasion, especially since the Tang and the Caliphates were competing for influence all across Central Asia.
So they basically used the threat of Tang Chinese intervention as a massive deterrent.
Exactly.
Meanwhile, further south in Zabulistan, the Zunbils are executing a similarly successful resistance, but with a different financial dynamic.
The Zunbils were incredibly resilient. Arid governors operating out of Sistan would repeatedly launch campaigns into Zabulistan, attempting to secure the region and enforce the collection of tribute. And time after time, these armies were drawn into the mountains, outmaneuvered, and decisively defeated.
And the power dynamic shifts so drastically that the Zunbils actually reverse the flow of tribute.
They do. The sources record multiple instances where the Arab commanders, having suffered catastrophic losses and facing total annihilation in the highlands, were forced to negotiate peace treaties where they paid massive sums of silver to the Zunbils just to secure safe passage back to their own borders.
The supposedly unstoppable empire was paying protection money to a local mountain kingdom.
It's quite a reversal.
The Zunbils even leverage internal Arab conflicts to their advantage. We see this in the year 700 during the revolt of Ibn al-Ash'ath.
Yes, Ibn al-Ash'ath was an Arab commander who led a massive, exceptionally well-equipped force known as the Peacock Army.
Right.
He was initially tasked with subduing the Zunbils. However, he mutinied against the central Umayyad governor of Iraq. When his rebellion against the state eventually faltered and his forces were routed, he retreated eastward.
And he seeks asylum with the very enemy he was sent to destroy.
The Zunbils granted him sanctuary. They formed an alliance with the Arab rebels, providing them with military support and a safe haven against the Umayyad armies pursuing them.
That is incredibly pragmatic.
It demonstrates exactly how fluid the political landscape was. The Zunbils were pragmatic enough to ally with a faction of their invaders if it weakened the central authority of the caliphate.
The confidence of these local rulers during this period of resistance is perfectly encapsulated by the reign of Fromo Khazaro, who ruled the Turk Shahis from 739 to 745.
Fromo Khazaro presided over a period of significant military success against the Arab forces attempting to push into the Kabul Valley. But he didn't just win battles. He engaged in a highly effective form of economic and psychological warfare.
The sources detail how he handled captured currency, which is just wild.
It is. During his campaigns, Fromo Khazaro captured large quantities of Arab silver dirhams. Instead of simply melting them down for bullion, he had these coins overstruck with his own name and titles in the Bactrian script.
He literally takes the economic symbol of the caliphate, stamps his own face on it, and circulates it right back into the economy.
It is such a potent broadcast of sovereignty. Every merchant who handled one of those overstruck dirhams saw a physical testament to the failure of the caliphate's armies and the enduring power of the Kabul Shahis.
We are looking at a scenario where local forces use asymmetric warfare and the geography of the mountains as a massive force multiplier to hold off the greatest empires of late antiquity.
Yeah.
But this resistance does eventually break.
It does. The turning point arrives in 815. The Abbasid Caliphate, having stabilized after a period of destructive internal civil war, focuses its immense resources on a coordinated, overwhelming campaign against the Turk Shahis in Kabul.
They finally crack the fortress.
They do. The Abbasid forces decisively defeat the Shahi army. The king is captured, forced to formally submit to the caliph, agree to an exorbitant annual tribute, and nominally convert to Islam. While the Shahis do retain some local authority, their era of independent, impenetrable resistance is officially over.
But here is the critical twist in the narrative. While the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad managed to force the submission of Kabul in 815, it is not the distant Arab center that ultimately fully integrates this region, is it?
No, it's not. The final military conquests actually come from within.
Right.
The 9th and 10th centuries see a fundamental decentralization of power in the Islamic world. The authority of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad begins to wane, and regional governors start asserting their independence. In the east, this vacuum is filled by local, newly Islamicized Iranian and Turkic dynasties.
Which brings us to the rise of the Saffarids and a commander named Yaqub ibn al-Layth.
Yaqub ibn al-Layth is such a disruptor. He rises completely outside the traditional aristocratic structures. The sources trace his origins to a coppersmith's apprentice in Sistan.
Really? A coppersmith?
Yeah. He joined bands of local vigilantes, essentially armed groups operating on the fringes of state control. Through sheer military brilliance, ruthlessness, and an appeal to local Iranian identity against the Arab center, he unified these factions and seized control of Sistan in 861, founding the Saffarid dynasty.
And he immediately turns his attention to the unconquered territories in the east.
He was fiercely ambitious and commanded a highly motivated, battle-hardened army. In 870, he launched a massive campaign eastward through Bost, Kandahar, and Ghazni.
Right into the Zunbil heartland.
Exactly. He brought the full weight of his military against the Zunbils, decisively defeating them, capturing their capital, and permanently ending their centuries-long independent rule.
He succeeds where generations of caliphal armies just failed completely.
He then pushed northward, capturing Kabul from the remnants of the Shahis. The Saffarid campaigns effectively ended non-Muslim political control in the southern and eastern regions, bringing them firmly into the Islamic political sphere.
But the Saffarids are merely the precursor to an even more dominant power that emerges shortly after the Ghaznavids. And to understand the Ghaznavid juggernaut, we have to examine the specific military mechanism that built their empire. The sources emphasize the Ghulam system.
The Ghulam system is arguably the most critical institutional development of this entire era. A Ghulam was essentially a military slave.
I really want to unpack the sociology and the psychology of this concept, because to a modern listener, the idea that a state would build its most elite, heavily armed, and politically powerful military units out of enslaved captives just seems like a recipe for immediate rebellion.
It does sound counterintuitive.
How does a society function when its highest-ranking generals are slaves?
Right. The effectiveness of the Ghulam system relies on a radical process of detachment and dependency.
Okay, break that down for me.
In a traditional feudal or tribal army, a soldier's primary loyalty is local. He is loyal to his family, his clan, his tribal elders, or the specific plot of land he inherited.
Right, his roots are at home.
Exactly. When a ruler orders a tribal levy to go to war, those soldiers are constantly weighing the ruler's commands against the interests of their own kin. This creates armies that are prone to factionalism, mutiny, and political interference.
They have competing loyalties.
Precisely. The Ghulam system engineers those competing loyalties out of existence. Ghulams were typically captured as youths from the Turkic steppes of Central Asia, far beyond the borders of the empire.
Okay.
They were purchased by the state, entirely severed from their native families, their culture, and their homeland.
They are essentially blank slates.
They are. They are brought into the Islamic core, converted to Islam, and subjected to years of intense, highly disciplined martial training. The state becomes their family. The ruler who purchased them and trained them is their only patron.
Right.
Once their training is complete, they are manumitted, freed, and inducted into the elite cavalry.
But they still have no local ties. They don't own ancestral estates in the provinces.
And that is exactly the secret to their loyalty. A Ghulam's entire identity, social status, wealth, and physical survival are bound exclusively to the sovereign. If the ruler falls, the Ghulams lose everything because they have no local constituency to fall back on.
That makes perfect sense.
This structural dependency allowed rulers to field highly professional, fiercely cohesive standing armies that would execute orders with ruthless efficiency, totally unburdened by local political concerns.
And the founder of the Ghaznavid dynasty, Sebuktigin, is a product of this exact system.
Sebuktigin originated as a Turkic captive. He was purchased as a Ghulam, trained and integrated into the military elite of the Samanid dynasty. He rose through the ranks based purely on his military competence, eventually carving out his own autonomous power base in the city of Ghazna in 977.
He used the very system that enslaved him to lay the foundations of an empire.
He did.
But it is his son, Mahmud of Ghazni, who fully unleashes the potential of this Ghulam army.
Mahmud of Ghazni, ruling from 997 to 1030, inherited this highly disciplined, multinational force of Turkic Ghulams, augmented by local Afghan tribesmen. He recognized that to maintain this incredibly expensive standing army, he needed constant revenue.
So he turned this military machine toward the immense wealth of the Indian subcontinent?
He did. The sources detail his campaigns into India as a massive escalation in regional warfare.
How many campaigns have we talking?
Mahmud launched over a dozen massive, heavily organized raids into northern India. He systematically destroyed the remnants of the Hindu Shahi resistance that had relocated there, pushed deep into the Punjab, and targeted major, wealthy Hindu temple complexes.
And the amount of plunder must have been.
The sheer volume of wealth, gold, silver, jewels, and captives extracted from these campaigns was staggering.
It is a self-sustaining cycle of imperial expansion. The wealth funds the elite Ghulam army. The army conquers more territory, extracts more wealth, and the empire just keeps expanding.
Mahmud used this plundered wealth to transform his capital, Ghazni, from a regional stronghold into one of the most magnificent cultural, architectural, and intellectual centers of the Islamic world, attracting scholars and poets from across the continent. By the time of Mahmud's death, the political conquest of the region was absolute. The ancient pre-Islamic dynasties were completely eradicated.
We have traced the mechanics of the military conquests, the shifting tax codes, and the rise of local Islamic empires. But the political conquest is only one layer of the canyon wall.
Right?
How does the cultural and religious identity of Islam permanently embed itself into the physical landscape and the daily lives of the population over the following centuries?
We see the long-tail Islamization most clearly in the phenomenon of religious syncretism regarding sacred spaces.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, the local populations didn't simply abandon the sites they had venerated for centuries, they reinterpreted them.
The sources provide a fascinating example of this with a site in Balkh known as Gushtasp's Mound.
Gushtasp's Mound perfectly illustrates this layering process. The archaeological evidence suggests that this site originally functioned as a prominent Buddhist structure, likely a massive stupa, serving as a focal point for regional devotion.
So it begins as a Buddhist site.
Then, during the Sasanian era, as Zoroastrian influence grew, the local population began associating the exact same mound with a figure named Gushtasp, who was revered in local lore as the legendary royal patron of the prophet Zoroaster.
The physical mound doesn't change, but the narrative does.
Exactly. And the process repeats after the Islamic conquest. Centuries later, local Muslim populations and scholars began to claim that this very same mound was actually the burial site of the biblical and Quranic figure Job.
So it goes from a Buddhist stupa to a Zoroastrian monument to the tomb of an Islamic prophet.
The physical geography retained its sacred status across three entirely different religious epochs. The local people adapted their ancient veneration to fit the new Islamic narratives, essentially rooting the new faith in the ancient, sacred soil of their ancestors.
It allowed for a psychological continuity even as the theological framework changed entirely.
Exactly.
That explains the cultural acculturation on the ground. But the final consolidation of Islamic identity, where it becomes the absolute uniform law of the land, happens much, much later. The sources direct us to fast forward a millennium to the late 19th century.
This leap in time is crucial to understand that Islamization is a continuous process. In the late 19th century, Emir Abdurrahman, known as the Iron Emir, takes control of the Afghan state.
And the state he inherits is still highly fractured, isn't it? Despite 1,000 years of Islamic presence, the region is not operating under a single unified system.
Not at all. Abdurrahman faced a landscape dominated by autonomous tribes, powerful local khans, and vast regions that govern themselves according to ancient customary laws and tribal councils, largely ignoring the central government in Kabul. Abdurrahman's primary objective was absolute centralization. He wanted to build a modern, unified nation-state. And to achieve that, he utilized the concept of Islamic law, Sharia, not merely as a religious framework, but as his primary weapon for state building.
How does he implement that practically? I mean, how does Sharia help centralize a fractured state?
By establishing a total monopoly on justice. Prior to his reign, if there was a dispute over land or inheritance in a rural province, it was settled by local tribal elders using unwritten customary law.
Right.
Abdurrahman systematically dismantled those local councils. He replaced them with a network of state-appointed courts administered by judges trained in a uniform interpretation of Sharia law, which was dictated by Kabul.
He removes the legal authority from the local tribes and transfers it entirely to the central government.
He established that the only legitimate law was the law of the state, articulated through religion. Furthermore, he explicitly used the religious language of jihad to justify brutal military campaigns against any faction that resisted this centralization.
Like the Hazara.
Yes, he launched devastating wars against the Hazaras in the Central Highlands to break their autonomy.
The sources also highlight his campaign into a region known as Kafiristan.
Kafiristan, which translates to the land of the infidels, was a highly isolated mountainous region in the east that had somehow managed to retain its ancient pre-Islamic polytheistic religion right up until the 1890s.
Wow, that long.
Yeah. Abdurrahman invaded the region, militarily subjugated the population, forced their mass conversion to Islam, and subsequently renamed the territory Nuristan, meaning the land of light.
He uses the state military apparatus to forcibly complete the religious conversion of the final holdouts. When we step back and view this entire timeline from the initial Arab cavalry raids in the 650s to the tax-driven conversions of the Bactrian farmers, the 200-year insurgency of the Turk Shahis, the Ghulam armies of Ghazni, and finally the legal centralization of the Iron Emir in the 1890s, we see that this was never a single event.
No, not at all.
It is a process that spans over 1,000 years. It is like a landscape being slowly carved by a massive river. The water eventually reshapes the terrain, cutting new valleys and canyons, yet it inevitably flows over, around, and incorporates the ancient rocks that were already there.
The institutions change, the laws change, but the foundational geography and the localized adaptations dictate the pace and the nature of that change.
We have covered a massive amount of historical ground in this deep dive, tracing the intricate mechanisms of conquest, resistance, and integration.
We have, and to conclude our analysis of these sources, I encourage you to look at a modern geopolitical map of this region today.
Okay.
Consider the friction points, the internal boundaries, and the persistent regional identities that dominate modern news cycles. Many of those modern fault lines are not recent creations. They map directly onto the ancient administrative borders established by 7th century Arab tax collectors, the logistical limits of Umayyad cavalry in the Hindu Kush, and the defensive perimeters of the Turk Shahis.
It all connects.
The geopolitical realities we grapple with today are direct descendants of the economic and military decisions made during the very centuries we have just explored.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.